Mark, tell me a bit about yourself and how your professional journey has taken where you are today.
Well, I didn't start in education. In fact, I worked in government service for a few years. And then my first professional role, having studied music at university, was as a lecturer at the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester. And it's only after that that I ended up perhaps having had the influence of both my parents, who were primary school teachers, that I decided that that was something I'd like to do. So, as a mature student, I trained at university again in the north of England. And from that, I had quite a successful career in a variety of primary schools, going up to leadership. I was a deputy head in the school in my last role. And at that point, I kind of stepped sideways and I went into, shall we say, education leadership within a university. And I worked as a school partnership manager at a big university. And then from then on, through a range of other universities, I gravitated to where I am now at Bishop Grosseteste University as placement lead for the PGCE primary. And that basically means I'm responsible for both the organisation of the placements once the students have been allocated, and making sure that it all runs well. And of course, I'm dealing with mainly postgraduate students who have got a wide experience, often of the working world prior to entering teaching, as well as as I had, in fact, which was I entered teaching as a mature student. And so that's a great advantage for them, but also those, perhaps the majority, who've just done their first degree, then decide that teaching is something they'd like to do. So they then go on and do this 1 year course, which really prepares them, I think, extremely well for career as a classroom teacher in primary. And we offer two age phases, 3 to 7. So those trainees would all do placement in a nursery in the earliest foundation stage, as well as Key Stage 1, or 5 to 11. And so those would do Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. None of which restricts them later on. I did an early years pathway, and then in my second year of teaching, I was in year 6. So I explained to the trainees, get as much experience as you can in all the different classes that are commensurate with your particular placement. And you never know, in the future, you might see yourself now as an early years person, and then in a few years decide I have the opportunity to change and enjoy working with the older children just as much. So that basically brings me to where I am now. Now, what I didn't say was that my early life was a professional musician, and hence the music degree, and then my job at the Royal Northern College of Music. It's at that time my doctorate was in Spanish music. I studied the music of a composer called Enrique Granados, who was in fact Catalan. From most of his work was around Barcelona. But it's that in a strange way has led me to my interest in Spanish education. And so understanding Spanish and understanding a little of the Spanish culture, a great deal, which was relevant to the period of music I was studying at the time, 19th, early 20th century, led me to develop that interest. Once I moved into teaching myself, it seemed logical then to find out more about Spanish schools, since I could speak the language. And since then, really since I started in HE, I've maintained strong links with the University of Granada. I go out fairly frequently to sometimes giving lectures to their primary education students. I mean, education of teachers in Spain is very different. We might get onto that, which is something I very much enjoy. Every year I've been going specifically to Granada, which is a historic city in Andalusia. And as I learn more about education, both within Andalusia, one of the 17 autonomous regions within Spain, and Spain as a whole, I think a lot about the differences in the systems, and they've all got strengths and differences. And if I talk in this podcast about differences, it's not because I think one way's better than another. Clearly, I don't think that. But nonetheless, there are striking differences, and I think this is as much a value for our trainees who probably will never teach beyond our shores, but nonetheless to be aware of essentially a different ideology to a degree, if you could say that, a different way of planning the education, makes them more aware of what they do themselves in our country. So I think international comparisons, whether you are from the UK looking out or at another country looking in at us, are always extremely valuable because they help you to understand, by contrast, they help you to understand your own system perhaps in a slightly different way.
Mm. Okay, I think that's really interesting, and we're definitely going to go into much more about the kind of Spanish system. But before that, I was just wondering, from your own experience as a senior lecturer, in the kind of primary education or primary teacher education field, what do you see as the biggest challenge, if you like, in the UK in terms of, teacher education?
It's the challenges for our government, and it is really all around recruitment and retention.
Mm.
The numbers, whilst there was a slight boost in COVID years, all providers are finding the same thing. It's becoming harder to fill their courses. Long time there have been recruitment problems. For instance, getting head teachers in some areas is very, very difficult. And the union stats will tell the same story, which has been the case now for the past few years. Within around 5 years, up to a quarter of new entrants to the profession will have gone. What a loss that is. So to basically, in short, the challenge for us is to try and motivate teachers as much as we can, and provide them with the skills they need to work flexibly in different age phases and so on. I mean, part of this is requirements anyway of the statutory requirements for being a teacher, but we can give them the skills that they will need. But there's only so much we can do. Ultimately, the control of the teaching profession and how they feel recompensed for the work they do. We have to be mindful that there's been a strike here fairly recently. Today, in fact, in Scotland, teaching assistants are all on strike, which is going to cause no small amount of a problem for those parents who can't get their kids to school. But anyway, so I think it's really a thing for the government to take seriously. And whilst I have lots of views on that, I feel that the teaching profession and indeed university educators have limited ability to influence government. Historically, governments are motivated by political reasons about what happens in schools and in the training of teachers more than anything else. And whilst we'll all have our views about what we could do, they're going to have limited impact. And I just hope that one thing, it will be a huge crisis for any nation not to have enough teachers. I think it's problematic that not enough are staying. 5 years, a huge number leaving. But what a huge loss to the profession that is. And
Where
to
are
bring
we
in the
going?
first, sorry, I'm sorry,
No,
Phil.
no, that's okay. Where are we going wrong?
Well, I think it's workload and pressure. And let's say we start with our system of accountability, and you could say that began almost way back in the 80s with Thatcher and so on, with public bodies, whether it's response times for ambulance drivers or industry, an industry model about productivity and profit. And I don't think can be applied in the same way or should be to school, but here it's huge. Governments successively, whether left or right, set their targets for schools as part of their national education agenda. And this inevitably falls on hard-pressed head teachers and governing bodies. Needless to say, then, it's all to do with pupil attainment and progress. Needless to say, then, this is passed down to the staff. And typically, when teachers leave, they will say, or whether they be head teachers or the rank and file who work in the classroom, the chalk face, you could say, they'll say, pressure, too much. I'm working 24/7. I'm working at the weekend. I'm working late into the evening, getting things ready. And when I think about Spain, where, well, for different reasons, I mean, their teachers are civil servants. They will typically teach for at least 30 years. But alongside that, whereas there's a culture here of accountability, and almost like it's mandatory that every parent should know which schools are working well and which aren't, and Ofsted makes sure that that's the case through their inspection cycle. In Spain, in comparison, whilst at a local level, parents might talk about this school or that school, it's completely the reverse. There's no public accountability in quite the same way. And so therefore, head teachers in no way do they have the same kind of pressure. This is why on my visits to some of the schools in Granada, I find year on year, the same people who've been voted in to be the head doing the job and enjoying it, and their responsibilities are totally different. Now, it's so easy to make this sort of comparison. So why aren't we the same? There's so many other factors which prevent that, but it's worth considering. And I do think this culture of accountability which we have here, not helpful at all. It is one of the main reasons, to get back to your question, why teachers and head teachers feel under so much pressure.
Mm. So what is it like? What is it like to be a teacher in Spain?
Well, I would say whether it's at a primary school or a secondary school, and bear in mind, I know much more about the primary system. I would have to say it's more relaxed. Now, if you talk to teachers in Spain, the things they say which are problematic or give them more pressure, to some degree are the same as teachers here and probably anywhere. When I say here, I'm talking about England rather than the UK, because we have these different systems, don't we? So behavior, of course, that's just as much of an issue for Spanish teachers. Parental pressure, again, they have run-ins with parents just like we do. In terms of workload, I would say perhaps not quite the same. In no way. I mean, my experience of being in the schools is arriving often perilously close to 9 o'clock with the teacher who maybe has given me a lift in, unlocking the classroom door and letting the kids in, and then having a conversation with me about what I've been doing and the rest of the morning as they get on with their textbooks. They spend less time in school typically, and will be going early afternoon, maybe one staff meeting a week. British teachers or English teachers, it's probably not so different in the other regions, spend a lot more time in school from early before the children get there until way after they've gone. Now, that wasn't the case in the times when my parents were teachers. I remember tripping down to school with my mother in the morning, just before 9 o'clock. She would get into the. Now, that was in the as late as the, late 70s, early 80s. Now, perhaps those watching this say, well, that was unacceptable. Things have got so much better now that teachers are there for longer and they're forced to plan more and blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm not convinced that anything is better in the outcome now than it was then. In what way? Whether we're taking, I mean, there have been improvements in reading. That's true. Recently, if we look at the PISA league tables, but in terms of society, have we got a better society because children are driven, if you like, more and are more accountable? I don't think in any way. In some ways, things are deteriorating in a way which nobody perhaps could have expected. But this is a complicated issue. So I would say, to get back to your point, Spanish teachers probably have a little bit of an easier life, I would say. And
why is the workload so different, Mark?
Well, whilst there's a national curriculum, and an organic law of education in Spain, um, I would think it is more to do with custom and an expectation. Um, uh, from, this is getting right down now into the nature of politics and how governments think and work. But I do think the um, the impact of Thatcherism has repercussions straight away in education, and those which have continued, which every government subsequently has felt obliged to maintain. And whilst you would get someone like Chris Woodhead, who was head of Ofsted um, at the time I'm talking about, talking very dismissively about child-centered education in the 60s and so on. He would refer to the mythology of child-centered education, and where the child would learn by doing and so on. He would say, no, 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 they can be taught, and they must be, and we must get rid of this nonsense of learning through play. Now, whilst I'm not saying people are quite so dismissive of play now, nonetheless, what has stuck is this total need for accountability. And, every time you see an Ofsted banner which says outstanding school, outstanding or good, it's two things. One, a source of pride, I guess, for the school, but it's also a statement about the government that's put this system in place. Outstanding, that means the government's doing its job. And it's in their interest to always make sure that the number of schools who are judged to be good or outstanding is always the vast majority. And so it's become a political thing, I think, very much so. Whereas in Spain, as I said earlier, there isn't this need to put one school against another and say, have some sort of public level of accountability, which they're forced to work towards, and in a way which means targets for head teachers, and therefore the staff below them. And it's that pressure that I think causes the problem, the lack of retention, the difficulty in some areas of recruiting head teachers with the right qualities and so on. I think that is the biggest problem, and it's markedly absent. Now, what I need to say is that most Spanish teachers are what we would call civil servants, funcionarios, but not civil servants like we know them here, who are people who work in the government office, aren't they? Like there are plenty in the Department of Education. Civil servant is someone essentially a public worker for the state. It could be a fireman, for instance. So not civil servants in the way we might describe them, but what they have is, as a civil servant, and it varies profession to profession, the continuity of knowing that they will have a job pretty much for the rest of their professional career and a very good pension to follow that. And so typically, once qualified, teachers will stay for at least 30 to 35 years in the profession at primary and secondary level, and at that point then leave with a good pension. The amount you get depends on exactly how many years after 30 you do, but that is clearly advantageous, and one reason why teachers stay. To become a teacher, I don't want to preempt any other question you might have, is to become a civil servant, and is therefore to have to take oposiciones, competitive examination. Every year, each region will offer a certain number of places, and the number of people therefore offered a job, and you don't choose where you go. If you get the threshold, you'll be allocated somewhere, and typically only as your career develops will you find you can, and you perhaps have a family and children, will you be allowed to stay for longer in a place. So it's highly competitive, and that is another big difference to what we have here in England, where once you're qualified, you then unless you're working for something like an employment-based school direct route, which is frankly it being phased out, you just have to apply and find a job in the area you'd like to work in. Now, to link to that, it's fair to say that the opposiciones are focused a lot on the theory of teaching. There is very little emphasis in Spanish teacher training, and typically the postgrad route for primary in the way we know it doesn't exist, but they'll do a 4-year program. In the 3rd and 4th years, there will be practicum, practical experience in school. But it is not, if the leitmotif of this talk is about pressure and not pressure, well, there's certainly very little pressure associated with that. They gain knowledge of the children, the teachers, the processes, they'll get opportunities to teach. But whereas in England, that is highly structured with very, very clear expectations, and students who are judged to have failed to meet the expectations by mainly through the fact they can't demonstrate the teacher standards at the end of their program. In Spain, it's more a case administrative. You attend your placement, and nobody's going to fail you. You take your oposiciones, and well, you then take your job in school, and a lot of training is done in centres of education. Once you're trained, you'll be supported and you'll be observed closely in your first year in Spain. But it has to be said that to go on that pathway, if you're offered a full-time job, it's more to do, but all to do with your ability to pass an exam and get a high mark than your ability to be an outstanding classroom practitioner. You could be an outstanding practitioner and just fail the exam, and then you would have to work as a substitute teacher, someone who is essentially like supply, or work in a semi-private school, something in that capacity, but you will not get all those benefits that come from being a civil servant and having the pension. And so every year, trainees who are getting toward the end of their program, ready to take the oposiciones, many will seek support, almost like a cramming class. And I have friends who work with such trainees in the evening after uni, helping them develop the skills and the qualities they need to do well in an exam. So they're really priming them, because so much depends on getting this mark. And, I can only imagine the delight and the joy of any trainee who gets that email or letter to say, congratulations, you've passed and you're going to be offered a position in the school, because that's the beginning of the next 30 or 35 years.
So how do you ensure quality if there is little emphasis on what you actually do in a classroom? And as you mentioned, which I suppose can be quite problematic, when you've got somebody who's very good in a classroom, but then actually don't get to be qualified because they don't pass the exam.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, whilst there is an inspectorate in Spain, it doesn't have the same power as Ofsted, nor should it. Teachers will be observed; they'll be given targets, but at that point, I would say the comparison ends. It's virtually impossible for a failing teacher, someone who struggled to control the class, to be removed. Virtually impossible. And they were offered support and training. Were they to make the decision themselves to leave, then I guess they would. I don't have any statistics about this, other than to say that firstly, it's about schools supporting the trainees and making the decisions. All schools have what's called a consejo escolar, a council usually not involving many teachers, it's obligatory for the head teacher to be involved. Parents, pupils, who will reflect on all matters of school life and will, have some impact, I guess, in terms of quality assurance. But the ability of the Consejería of Education to sort of go in and change things around in a way that Ofsted might mandate here in the case of a failing school is unheard of. So perhaps because there isn't this accountability, the question doesn't arise in quite the same way. When it's assumed that all schools are equal and they're all doing a reasonable job. And I'm quite sure that's probably the case. It's only in our system that schools are judged by comparison to be failing. Now, in reality, is this concept of failure one that is fairly applied? It certainly is one that's backed up by Ofsted's own criteria, but as we know, which has devastating consequences in some cases, leading even to suicide, where a head teacher has been shamed by a failing inspection. But it's probably fair to say that schools in every nation have challenges, and one only assumes that the staff should be motivated to work together to address those as they arise. Whether it's necessary to have this invasive and critical regime of inspection which we have here, whether it really makes all that much difference and whether it's really necessary, I have to say, speaking for myself, not for my university, I would question. So to answer your question, I think schools themselves are very good at Spain and moderating what they do and deciding on how they should develop. Sorry.
That's okay. Do you feel like it is a problem, though, when the motivation from the teachers is based on their career in terms of how long it can be and also the pensions that they get, rather than, sort of, I suppose, in terms of being able to support the students and being able to make a difference, that sort of thing? It kind of doesn't sit very easy with me when it comes to teachers like, well, I want to get into the profession itself, but then as soon as I've got into it, then I've got like a 35-year well-paid job.
Yep.
And then I've got good pension to look forward to, but then it almost doesn't matter how you do and how you get through the 35 years. What do you think to that?
I think that's a fair comment. And of course, it will be a very difficult thing to investigate, because the last thing I want to do is say, well, of course, teachers aren't committed. Clearly, as a teacher, nobody can do that job without having to think about what they're doing, because ultimately parents care about what their children do, and they certainly will make their voices heard. And as much as they can accommodate those parents' wishes and respond to their expectations, I'm sure Spanish teachers will. I can't imagine anyone would just choose this option without having some feeling for children and wanting to be in front of them. I can't imagine that they would stay in the profession. Teaching's hard without the imposition of extra targets and demands. It's hard enough to keep children learning, and everyone knows that a class that are engaged and focused in what they do are much more manageable than those who, anyone who thought, well, I'm a teacher now, I don't care, would find that they had the most awful challenges to confront. So I don't think that would really arise. I think once they become, whatever their reasons initially, once you become a teacher, the system kind of takes over and you kind of have to really do your best, or you'll start to find that it becomes quite challenging.
So going back to the issue of workload, which has been cited by many people, including government themselves to be a retention problem. I'm just wondering, what is it that the Spanish teachers do less than the teachers in the UK or England, so that it makes their role to be so different between the two?
Yeah, well, probably less evaluation in the way that's required, accountability, that they will plan and they will monitor how children do. Of course, that's what all teachers do, but perhaps they're not required to adhere to such rigid frameworks as we have. Whilst as a curriculum, I in England, as much as in Spain as well, I've never got the impression that teachers have had to struggle a great deal in that side of things. Also, within Spanish primary schools, there's a huge emphasis on using textbooks. Even I've seen this in the first cycle, the second cycle of infant education. 4, 5, 6 year olds with a book, which they're cutting, they're sticking things in. In this particular case, I'm thinking of, it was for learning English, and great many schools. There's a huge emphasis on this, certainly in all regions, but in Andalusia are very, very good at creating these opportunities for learning another language early on. But as I say, to answer your question, I think it's also the fact that they have lots of textbooks, and they can say, open your book at page 3, page 12, and work and do the following chapter. And that clearly is much more straightforward and less problematic than having to plan, think outside the box and do something based on an annual a learning objective from a curriculum, which you then have to develop material for. That whilst that's something that gives a lot of joy to teachers, to have to plan and to be creative, there's no doubt that having a book with things in is a lot easier. Now, I'm not saying Spanish teachers don't do this sort of planning, and not all schools are the same. And the curriculum, I guess, like us, is more formal for English and maths, but then there are more freedoms for the other things later. But fundamentally, it's that, I think. It's the core subjects that take up English teachers' time, English and maths, and having the book that they can say. And as well, there's less of a requirement to be accountable and to report all the time about what's happening, makes things a lot more laid back.
So when it comes to using textbooks and things like that, which obviously, as you said, makes the job a bit easier for the teacher, I'm just wondering how that kind of approach would affect the level of engagement from the students, because obviously, I suppose one of the values with creativity, as we know in teaching and learning, is that it could sometimes, maybe usually, promote some kind of engagement or enhanced engagement. And so without the kind of like more bespoke or different, like you mentioned, outside the box sort of approach, would that make teaching and learning a little bit more standardized or maybe bland, perhaps even?
Maybe. And well, I can't comment further on that. I guess, and I don't know enough about this to be able to speak with authority, that just like here, there's a certain commercial enterprise in production of school textbooks, and they will sell things in the way they can to appeal to the teachers and to the schools. But beyond that, I can't say. You might be right, but that's something that would be better debated, I think, with teachers now in Spain to get their view on what they do.
Yep, totally understand. Okay, so what about head teachers in terms of, them being in a job and what they do, and also the accountability side of things and what they're responsible for? What does that look like?
Well, they um, have a very, very different role. Again, since the Thatcherism and so on, we had local management of schools. Schools increasingly hived off the local authority, which don't exist in quite the same way that they used to. They have certain responsibility for overseeing special education and so on, but basically, head teachers now are responsible for not only the teaching and learning in the school, but all the financial aspects of that as well. Can have a huge, huge budget to have to manage, covering, of course, the salaries, but every other aspect for organising the repairs. And I would say that the head teacher has to be very different from the ones I remember from school. Before all this came in, I'm talking about the 60s now. A head teacher could be a head and come into the class and support learning and whatever they felt was necessary. They didn't have to worry about budgets. So here we have that local management, a huge emphasis on financial accountability, for instance, as well as learning. And of course, the person who has to be accountable for SATs and the outcomes at the end of Key Stage 2, where they're still publicly available, or beyond that in secondary and so on. Now, in Spain, head teachers don't have to worry about that, nor do administrators in universities. Well, just to take that example, Granada University has a faculty of the sciences of education, for primary education, which employs many hundreds of staff, thousands of students, so at least 3 times as big as the whole of Bishop Grosseteste University. The Dean of Education has all this responsibility and never has to think about money. Can you imagine? Doesn't have to think about that. And the same is true. It's a continental model. Academics tend not to have this issue. So he can think about the student experience and so on. So head teachers, similarly, in schools, they don't have to spend a great deal of time thinking about money. If the school needs repairs doing, then they'll be on the phone to somebody who can sort that out. They aren't personally responsible for that, so they can think about their staff. As I said, the system of accountability is much, much less rigorous in that sense. It's local. The parents and the school will work together and talk about that, but there's no publicly shaming schools and putting them in league tables as happens here. Well, the press do that, but even so, the data's available. So naturally people make this step towards seeing who's got closest to 100% in their Key Stage 2 SATs and so on. That doesn't exist. So it's much less pressure from the head teacher on what they do. Now, the other thing is that whereas here, headships are advertised. It's always been the way, and anyone can apply. In Spain, just the whole conception of the role is seen differently, and typically those who become a head are often elected by the other members of the school team to be so. And not everyone wants to be a head, of course, but some do, and then they will do a certain amount of time, and then they'll be subject to re-election. And only in a case where there's either no agreement or nobody wants to do the job, at that point will the Consejería of Education then sort the matter out. But typically this isn't necessary, and schools will employ someone. And I've met heads in the different schools I visit, and they always have time to chat, to talk. They clearly have issues that are concerned. I don't just flit about. They have a very important job to do, steering the direction of travel, you could say, but one which I don't feel that they have got this huge pressure hanging over them about what may happen if they don't succeed in their endeavour. They seem to be much more relaxed about it, I have to say. So heads typically will do the job year in, year out for quite a long time until they tire of it and want to go back to being a class teacher. I think that's a wonderful way. The whole concept of leadership, therefore, whereas here it's kind of progression within industry or within education, it's the same kind of thing. You get a more important job, there's no looking back, and you get more money for doing it, and you've progressed. You progressed in life and have succeeded in your professional career because you've been promoted. I would probably say it's fair to say in Spain, headship's not considered in that type of way. So people become a head because they like the challenge and they want to do that. Then we'll flip back. Heads aren't well paid in the way that heads are here, where they are astronomical salaries, particularly if you work in London or you have quite a large school. Generally, salary is much, much less, but equally, the pressures are less too. And so that is why people will be stay in this role or share it for years.
Mm. So, what about strategic decision or strategic directions? Are the teachers, head teachers over in Spain, actually responsible for those, or is it more like coming from like the government, for example?
Well, I can't say with authority that the Consejería, like the body, if you like, who controls schools within each region, um, does not maintain contact with head teachers. I've not been a head in Spain, so I can't say. They will work with their staff and with their parents, and as I say, the Consejo Escolar, to formulate, if you like, plans and policy, but at no point are schools subject. Well, there have been changes to curriculums which have been problematic, but not with the same frequency that we get here with an imposition of years ago, a national literacy strategy or this thing or that thing, where all schools in England have to then, you know, follow the rule, follow the orders, and comply whichever directive is issued in a much more overt way than would be the case in Spain, where I would say there's less interference. And interference is a very politically loaded word. Government would say, no, 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 no. What we do is for the benefit of learning and standards. And the best schools prove that our interventions are necessary. But it could be argued that such interference, such measures in place aim to superficially promote higher standards aren't always necessary. And this is a big debate, but we do have this mindset very much here. And unfortunately, the teaching profession doesn't really have the ability to take on, to challenge the status quo. Yet I know many heads that I would talk to would wish to be able to do that, and far from happy with the way things are. There'll be those who absolutely love it. Well, I don't think Mark is really talking much sense. Clearly, Ofsted is a wonderful thing, and we those schools who have succeeded and been told that they're outstanding, no doubt, would have good reason to take that latter view. But I think no one could say to me that there isn't discontent, to go back to that fundamental question, within the profession. And the answer is, well, look, when I see queues of people wanting to train to be teachers and more teachers than there are jobs, when I see no vacancies for head teachers, then I will say something actually is working well, irrespective of any superficial use of international league tables to try and prove a point. When I see schools with motivated staff who stay in the profession, with head teachers who've had to work to where the position they've got, and then stay in place, then I think that's clearly going to be better. A school team that's in place and stays together is clearly going to build support and a way of working, a collegiate understanding, if you like, which can only be a good thing. Where schools have fractured leadership or no continuity, how can that help to build a cohesive learning team? Surely that
Mm.
is virtually impossible to do.
Okay, so to summarize, from your perspective, what can we learn from this comparison?
Well, I think um, we must continue to question what we do. And all teachers and all head teachers should say, question the validity of everything they're asked to do in terms of outcomes. And there ain't much choice at the moment. That you measured by the SATs, and they're very prescriptive kind of exam. And I'm not quite sure that as long as they're in place, there's much scope. There's a huge emphasis on core subjects. There's time given to what I might argue were actually more important issues like relationships and so on. Hugely important, but essentially they squeeze them in when they can. A good curriculum these things should inform all aspects of every lesson. But it's easy to say that. And reality, when I look at society now, I think, well, my view is that our national curriculum favours middle classes very well indeed, but not necessarily those who may not have the support at home or may struggle to access. They end up often falling by the wayside. And I know this is quite contentious, but when I see the way society is now, I'm not sure that we have a system that is fair for all and it ensures the best outcomes. I think there are always going to be those. Perhaps it's politically expedient in the bigger picture that this is the case, who don't have a fair bite of the apple, who don't get the support, who end up essentially failing, and that's not something I like to see.
Mm. So finally, what would you recommend that I should check out to find out more about this fascinating topic?
Well, um, I would say that the Eurydice website of the National Foundation for Educational Research has an awful lot of information about Spain and about Spanish education. In itself, it's a little bit mind-numbing. It's full of stats and information, as is OECD website, stuff about educational outcomes and comparisons and so on in the different subjects. So I think looking at school websites, of which I can provide a few, that is actually quite interesting, both public and private. And I think even more than that, I think education in any country represents that nation, those people. Spanish approaches to education are a representation of Spain and the people there. In no small way, the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, which has a huge presence in schools. And so I would say find out about Spain. And it's through understanding Spanish people that you will then better able to make sense of how the curriculum, how the school is. And it's those bigger things that I think are more important than just looking at stats about the organization of the school day or the cycles of education, meaningless without understanding what Spain's all about. And whilst there's a lot of diversity within Spain, very apparent at the moment, and the secession and the desire for that within Catalonia. But for instance, you might look at Scotland in that respect for some sort of comparison. Nonetheless, beyond that, there's something about the Mediterranean identity, Spain, and the role of the church, and so on, which I think is worth exploring as a starter.
Great advice, I think. So, thank you, Mark, for such a fascinating conversation about this topic. And so, any last comments that you want to make before we finish?
Well, I would just say that discovering the education in another country is a very valuable thing. I work in, to my own lectures, to our postgrads, information, well, clearly about Spain, but about Scandinavia, for instance, particularly their innovative approach to early years education and so on. And whilst my message is always the same, I'm not saying, look, this is what they do here. Aren't they better than us? I've always avoided that. I think it's dangerous when you talk about international comparisons to then say, so this way is better than that way, because it's meaningless in a way. You can do that within any one nation, any one area. So I think learn about other places, whether it's Spain or whether it's your own country in comparison with England or different places. But then that, to me, helps you reflect on your own system, whether in a positive way or whether it helps you then start to identify shortcomings in what we have. And all teachers, they're failing, they're in a way, their school themselves, if they have a view and then they never share it. I don't want any teacher just to be a passive recipient. This is what we do. I'll do that. And I don't really care. This is what I have to be. This is what I'm told. So I'll do this. It's much better that you have an opinion and you share it. And as long as people talk and debate education, that's a good thing. The day comes when we have some sort of unseen, governing body telling us all what we should be doing without justification. I would dread that day. We must always challenge what we do, and sometimes international comparisons help us to be able to do that even more effectively.
Very well said. Couldn't have said it better myself. This is exactly what this podcast is for. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Phil. It's been great.